Deep in the Sonoran Desert lies the city of Nogales, actually two cities in one, divided by the border between the USA and Mexico. They share a similar geography and predominantly the same culture, but that's where the similarities end. Just a few meters to the north, incomes soar higher than in sevenfold, with most adults holding a complete secondary education and relatively high life expectancy, along with world-standard healthcare. Moreover, residents have access to all basic social infrastructure, despite occasional cases of political corruption. The government here is responsive to the citizens' wishes, and they don't live in constant fear of someone seizing their investments, companies, or jeopardizing their personal safety. A completely different picture unfolds in the southern part of Sonora, especially when compared in terms of homicide rates. In just 2 years, the Mexican side has exceeded 18-year statistics in the American part. Most of the adult population lacks a complete education, and the absence of a proper healthcare system makes mothers worry about their infants due to high infant mortality rates. Starting a business here is a risky endeavor, not just because of the high crime rates, but also because business owners constantly have to navigate through bribery and maneuver among corrupt local politicians. In almost all statistical indicators, Sonoran residents fall behind their neighbors in Nogales, Arizona. So, how did two halves of essentially the same city end up so different? This video dives into the complex story, shedding light on the stark disparities between these two border towns. Truly, Latin America's situation is the result of far deeper inequalities within the continent. South America has historically been much poorer than its northern neighbors, although this wasn't always the case. In fact, for most of its history, South America was the most coveted and sought-after piece of real estate in this hemisphere, both for its indigenous inhabitants and the early European colonizers. North America was sparsely populated, mainly by nomadic tribes, while complex indigenous civilizations existed closer to the tropics. Even in the more modern 19th and 20th centuries, countries like Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, and Venezuela were seen as potential world leaders, which in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was one of the world's top countries in terms of GDP per capita, even surpassing many of the richest nations. In the 1950s, Venezuela experienced an economic boom unlike anything South America had seen before. Within just 30 years, it rose to the third highest income per capita in the world, thanks to the discovery of vast oil reserves. Venezuela literally sat on the world's largest underground sea of oil, surpassing even the United States, the Soviet Union, and Saudi Arabia. After World War II, the demand for oil skyrocketed due to the rapid development of the automobile industry and the booming global trade. Venezuela was at the forefront of this economic windfall. For around 50 years, the country's economy grew by over 8% on average. However, as we know now, Venezuela is an economic catastrophe. It has experienced the largest economic collapse in modern history, with millions fleeing the country and hyperinflation rendering the national currency cheaper than toilet paper. While this may seem like an isolated case, it's not. Most South American countries have struggled to fully unlock their economic potential since gaining independence. When you compare the geography, South America actually has an advantage over North America. As we mentioned earlier, the cultural differences aren't significant. So why is Nogales, Arizona, living so much better than its sibling in Sonora? Why is North America wealthier than South America and not the other way around? After the Europeans set foot on the shores of the New World in the 15th century, the discovery of America and its subsequent colonization marked a significant turning point in the history of Latin America. In 1516, A daring expedition led by the seafarer Juan Diaz de Sol has forever altered the course of history. He sailed into the wide mouth of the river, proclaiming it as Spanish territory and naming it the Aro de la Plata, meaning the River of Silver. His choice of name stemmed from the abundance of silver artifacts he discovered among the local tribes, the Charawas and Querendese, who were skilled hunters and gatherers residing on both banks of the river. However, being brutally killed. Yet, the lust for riches, rather than despair, drove Spain to launch further expeditions for the colonization of these territories. In 1534, led by Pedro de Mendoza, colonists established settlements in what is now Buenos Aires, a name that literally translates to good winds. Unlike many regions in the north and Africa, the local climate here was moderate and favorable for European settlers. Nevertheless, these early settlements soon faltered because the settlers and conquistadors arrived in the New World not in search of new homes or favorable winds, but rather for wealth, treasure, and a labor force. The Charuas and Querendese were nomadic tribes who fiercely resisted the Spanish and refused to part with their goods or engage in trade with them, even as captives. This led to a dire shortage of resources among the colonists, as they had no intention of growing their own food. Eventually, it became evident that this land did not hold the riches the Spanish were seeking, neither silver to mine nor indigenous populations to exploit as laborers. In a last-ditch effort, a desperate colony sent out an expedition far and wide to find more fertile lands. One such expedition, led by Juan de Ayolas, followed the Paran River in search of silver deposits, guided by the silver artifacts they had glimpsed among the tube-like indigenous people. This expedition stumbled upon the Garan people, who were unlike the Charrua and Querendese. The Garan were skilled farmers with a settled way of life and an established societal hierarchy, including ruling elites managing surplus resources. The Spanish expeditions didn't hesitate to crush Garan resistance. They established Asunción N, which would later become the capital of Paraguay. The conquerors strategically intermarried with Garan royalty, thus becoming the new elites in the existing social hierarchy. They transformed the Garan systems by imposing tributes and forced labor. The remainder of Buenos Aires' population eventually moved to this new city, and this colonization strategy mirrored the Spanish and Portuguese approach elsewhere in the continent. They sought out indigenous societies with existing hierarchical structures and forcefully inserted themselves at the top to exploit the existing systems for their gain. Essentially, the most advanced and populous societies in this hemisphere were easier to exploit. This was a copycat approach, albeit a less bloody and significant one, of the more brutal and consequential conquests to the north. In 1519, against the advice of his advisors, King Montezuma invited Hernán Cortés to the capital of the Aztec Empire, Tenochtitlan. Cortés and his conquistadors swiftly captured Montezuma and used him as a hostage to gain access to the city's wealth. They melted down priceless Aztec artifacts into gold bars and shipped them back to Spain. By 1521, the Spanish had completely subjugated the once mighty empire. The thirst for wealth and the pursuit of riches were the driving forces behind these conquests, marking a turning point in history for Latin America. Moving forward, Cortés seized the most precious resource of the New World, its indigenous population. He introduced the system of encomiendas, essentially a royal grant from the Spanish crown that allocated a certain number of indigenous people to each conquistador. In return, Conquistadors were obligated to provide these indigenous individuals with employment and collect tribute from them. This system served as the cornerstone of the conquistadors' power. Through it, they exploited the local population, providing them with just enough to survive. Any surplus products were seized by the conquistadors, depleting once incredibly advanced and vast indigenous empires one by one. They conquered, divided, enslaved, and stripped them of resources. A prime example of this is the territory that now encompasses modern Peru and Bolivia. Just a decade after conquest, Francisco Pizarro embarked on a journey to perfect this strategy on November 15, 1532, when, along with other conquistadors, he set a trap for the Inca Emperor Atahualpa and his army. The Spanish demonstrated their brutal efficiency by defeating Incan soldiers and capturing Atahualpa. Still, the invaders subjected Atahualpa and his elite to horrific torture, demanding rooms filled with gold, silver, and all their treasures. Despite some complying, the captives were burned alive. After the conquest of the powerful Inca Empire, each conquistador received an encomienda, allowing them to replace the former Inca elite and subjugate the population. Eventually, an even more destructive form of control was implemented, particularly in the high Andes of modern Bolivia. In 1545, an expedition led by Gonzalo Pizarro stumbled upon a high mountain in Bolivia. When a powerful gust of wind forced them to the ground, they literally bumped their noses into an enormous deposit of silver ore. News of this discovery spread rapidly, and it turned out that the entire mountain was essentially pure silver. Over the next 2 centuries, this mountain, known as Cerro Rico or the Rich Hill, yielded over 40,000 tons of silver, valued at over $36 billion in today's prices. A city, photos, sprang up at the mountain's base, and its population swiftly grew to 160,000, surpassing Venice or Lisbon at the time. To fully exploit these incredible silver reserves, the Spanish required an extraordinary workforce. Spain dispatched the Viceroy of Peru, Francisco Toledo, to address this labor shortage. After 5 years of assessing the entire adult male Inca population, he implemented a complex set of policies and institutions that still strike fear into the hearts of Peruvian and Bolivian inhabitants today. The first step involved relocating the entire indigenous population of the former Inca Empire to reducciones, or concentrated settlements stretching from Cusco in the north to Fotos in the south. The settlers were supposed to live in these settlements. He then revamped the existing institution called MITA, which the Incas used to organize forced labor for agriculture, the military, and elites in exchange for support in case of crop failure or protection. Toledo enhanced the MITA system, significantly increasing the mobilization and exploitation of laborers. 1 out of every 7 men was required to work in the Fotos mines. In total, around 3 million people toiled there, with hundreds of thousands perishing in the process. The mines produced so much silver that, at one point, it likely made Fotos wealthier than all of Madrid. However, the riches flowed not to the indigenous people, but to the conquistadors and, ultimately, Spain. This insatiable hunger for wealth led to the spread of Spanish systems and institutions like MITA and encomienda throughout the entire Spanish colonial territory, from the southern tip of Argentina to northern California. The Spanish exploited these systems to extract maximum profit from subjugated populations through land expropriation, forced labor, exorbitant taxes, and meager wages. Eventually, Spain and its conquistadors, along with their descendants, found themselves living in a realm of unimaginable wealth. However, This intricate web of interconnected institutions for exploitation made South America the most unequal region in the world, decimating the economic potential of one of the most naturally endowed corners of the globe. While Spain was busy building its empire, England was recuperating from the tumultuous civil war of the 16th century. England was, at best, a secondary player on the European stage when it came to colonization. That all changed in 1588 when the English managed to destroy the Spanish Armada, a fleet poised to conquer the British Isles. This event marked a pivotal shift in the balance of power in Europe, signaling that Britain was now a maritime force to be reckoned with. It's no surprise then that soon after this triumph, the first English settlement in the New World emerged. At that time, Spain controlled the most valuable territories with dense indigenous populations, leaving the North American territories to England. The first English settlement, Jamestown, proved to be a dismal endeavor. The English attempted to apply the Spanish strategy of conquering indigenous peoples whom they intended to exploit as slaves. However, much like the failed venture of the Beneros in South America, there were few indigenous people to subjugate in North America. Additionally, these populations were decentralized and not interested in trade or subjugation. After numerous failed attempts, it was clear that the Spanish strategy wasn't suitable for North America. Though they couldn't force the labor of indigenous populations, perhaps the English settlers could entice them to work voluntarily. The Virginia Company took up the challenge and implemented a grueling policy, forcing the colony to work. However, with endless uncharted lands to explore, settlers could simply move on and establish their own lives, or even assimilate with local tribes. The latter option became increasingly appealing due to the dire conditions in Jamestown. Ultimately, this strategy also failed. The last attempt aimed to engage settlers in investing time, energy, and resources willingly. The Virginia Company provided plots of land to anyone willing to move to the colony and work. They also allowed representative assemblies, giving settlers a say in the laws that governed their lives. This laid the foundations for democracy and mechanisms that would eventually form the United States. Gradually, these assemblies gained significance in power. Since political authority and wealth were distributed widely among the population, it became increasingly difficult for any individual or group to manipulate power to their advantage. As these assemblies grew, they eventually led to the creation of the First Continental Congress, which determined that control over its members and their taxation should be in the hands of the people themselves. This decision culminated in the Declaration of Independence from Britain and the creation of the United States, a nation that further embraced the wide distribution of political power and established an environment that encouraged innovation and entrepreneurship. The ease of registering patents, obtaining loans, and starting companies significantly lowered the barriers to entry. In fact, statistics show that between 1,820 and 1,845, only 19% of patent holders came from professional or prominent landowning families, while a whopping 40% of patent holders had minimal or lower-leveled education. This demonstrates the power of a system where opportunity is accessible to all, regardless of their social or educational background. Among them, the record holder for patents was none other than Thomas Edison. Following this groundbreaking achievement, they harnessed the creative potential, productivity, and work ethic of their citizens, who were duly incentivized. This transformation eventually made the United States the wealthiest nation on the planet. However, this prosperity was a stark contrast to England's inability to employ the Spanish strategy in colonizing North America. The English realized that the only way to make their colonies productive was by motivating the settlers to work hard and invest. When the United States declared independence, a wider distribution of political power and the expansion of democracy stood in stark contrast to the independence movements in South America at the beginning of the 19th century. Institutions of colonial exploitation persisted in South America, either in their original form or slightly modified, to better serve the interests of the elite, who continued to rule and exploit the majority of the population. These masses, devoid of voting rights in determining their preferred form of government, remained without the gradual acquisition of rights and freedoms enjoyed by their North American neighbors. In other words, while the elite were content with the Spanish form of governance, the majority had no mechanism to break free from this grip. However, in 1808, the French army, under the command of Napoleon, invaded Spain. Local monarchies were swiftly overthrown, and a resistant government wrote a new constitution that significantly curtailed the power of colonial elites over the subjugated population of the New World. Fearing the loss of their political and economic leverage, and seizing the moment of Spain's weakness, the elites of South American countries declared independence from Spain, each in turn, in order to retain control over power and wealth. Instead of forming stronger and more equitable political systems post-independence, many South American governments became even more repressive towards their populations. Simply put, elites were satisfied with the Spanish form of rule, while the masses lacked a means of liberation. However, in Mexico, the situation took a particularly turbulent turn. Shortly after gaining independence between 1824 and 1867, the country saw an astounding 52 different presidents. The majority of these leaders came to power in defiance of Mexico's constitution, which resulted in extreme political instability. This instability led to a severe vulnerability of property rights and the weakening of the state, which lost control over vast territories. As a result, many northern territories seceded, ultimately favoring the United States due to their vulnerability. The Mexican economy suffered without a strong central government. Political stability. The Mexican economy suffered without a strong central government, political stability, and protected property rights. The lack of a reliable legal framework hindered innovation, and citizens with great ideas struggled to bring them to fruition. Access to loans was nearly impossible since the banking sector was highly uncompetitive. In stark contrast, the United States was undergoing a financial revolution. The number of banks in the U.S. increased from 338 in 1818 to 27,864 by 1914. And their combined assets grew from $160 million to over $27.5 billion during the same period. Mexico, with only 42 banks in 1910, two of which controlled 60% of the market, couldn't compete with this financial growth. High interest rates made loans accessible only to the wealthy established elites, who used their capital to further monopolize markets. This environment wasn't conducive for new ideas or businesses. However, what prevented bankers in the United States from pursuing similar monopolistic strategies were the checks and balances inherent in their political system. While some politicians allowed the formation of monopolies in exchange for gains, the presence of competitive elections meant that such politicians could be voted out of office. Unlike in South America, where political leaders remained unaccountable, in the United States, politicians were subject to competition between different candidates and parties. As a result, candidates who intended to prevent such monopolies emerged. They understood that monopolies were detrimental to the average citizen and swiftly dismantled them. This made the United States an environment where innovation thrived, as it allowed for easier access to patents, loans, and the establishment of companies. In conclusion, the motivation to combat monopolies existed in the United States due to competitive politics, while in South America, unchecked power and corruption persisted. ultimately hindering their economic progress. Differences in access to economic opportunities also manifested in a subtle yet significant manner. While the United States actively encouraged land cultivation by offering free land parcels, South American lands were seized by the elites who controlled vast territories. With the advent of international trade and the Industrial Revolution in the United States and Europe, resource-rich countries in South America became highly sought after. However, it was the local residents of South America who failed to fully capitalize on this extraordinary wealth. Meanwhile, the elites monopolized heavy industries, leaving other sectors vital for economic stability struggling. This only exacerbated the inequality. One of the reasons behind this transformation from one of the world's wealthiest economies to a hotbed of humanitarian crisis was the resource curse. This phenomenon occurs when abundant resources, such as oil, lead to the overvaluation of the national currency, resulting in the decline of other domestic industries. In addition, mismanagement of funds on social projects by leftist governments and subsequent hyperinflation took a toll. Almost every South American country experienced these challenges. Sugar, tobacco, precious metals, wood, emeralds, livestock, and more. These resources created immense wealth and income. However, these riches primarily flowed into the hands of a select few elites who held power at the time. Instead of building inclusive political systems and economic markets that could effectively harness the extraordinary wealth from resource extraction, many South American governments chose a different path. Democracy arrived late, and when it did, it often did so ineffectively. Corruption and lack of accountability still plagued the region's politics. Economic institutions only served those with political power. The gap between the wealthiest and the poorest continues to widen. In some countries, political elites wield more power than the law itself. This is in stark contrast to the United States, where you can easily start a company or purchase a home, confident that the government will protect your property rights. In South America, the ghosts of colonial institutions designed for exploitation continue to haunt the region. Political instability has made it difficult for central governments to maintain law and order across the entire country. This makes it challenging for ordinary citizens to establish their own businesses or invest, as monopolies remain unchecked. The result is further stagnation in productivity and income. South America was colonized for the purpose of exploitation, while in North America, this approach proved unsustainable. The difference in prosperity is not solely due to geography, culture, or disparities between British and Spanish empires. It is primarily attributed to institutions that shape the formation of distinct economic forces. We've carefully examined your comments. Please share your thoughts on the role of institutions in a country's economic development. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and sharing your ideas in the comments. Until next time, friends.